welcome back to the show. We're now in the land of the mountains, as its national anthem is known. We're in Austria for the second half of this Talking Europe agricultural special. Nestled in the Eastern Alps, some 60% of Austrian countryside is mountainous, and what's more, almost 90% of the farms are found along its slopes, meaning quite natural but specific constraints for farmers here. The latest reforms to the Common Agricultural Policy aim to do more for people trying to exploit such difficult terrain. We'll be meeting with the Minister for Agriculture in just a few minutes to find out if he thinks this has panned out into reality. But first, Johan Baudin brings us to meet the mountain farmers to see how they've turned some natural difficulties to their advantage.
As he contemplates his alpine surroundings each morning, Hannes couldn't imagine doing anything else.
This farm has belonged to my family for 200 years.
He's carrying on the family tradition. Here in the mountains, he has 30 hectares of forest and 28 hectares of meadow for grazing. Hannes inherited around 60 cattle. He's been rearing them for the past 2 years.
Here we produce in small quantity, but it's high quality. We show respect for the well-being of our animals and for nature. Our farm is a family business. I think that it's essential that a family farms in a responsible way. We're not an industry here.
Cattle rearing makes up only a quarter of his earnings, and together with forestry, he gets around 50% of his income from agriculture.
We need an additional revenue source to survive. We have to work to preserve this farm, but it offers a basic income and a home.
Hannes has had to diversify to sustain his farm. He runs a snow removal business in winter, which makes up another quarter of his income. And he increasingly spends his time in this office.
Now I earn most of my money here, behind my desk.
It's here that he works out how to obtain all available funds to keep his business afloat. Austrian farmers are renowned for being especially good at getting EU and Austrian government subsidies for environmental conservation.
We shouldn't be afraid of paperwork. All these subsidies are necessary and have become the norm in Austria.
Austria is one of the few member states that gets more in EU subsidies for rural conservation than for direct payments. Hannes takes in close to €10,000 each year in subsidies. He's also acquired a €250,000 loan for this store.
Apples, carrots, bottles of schnapps. We have a wide selection.
His store sells local products from surrounding farms. 2 million people visit this region every year. Hannes, the farmer, has become an entrepreneur and his business is going well. In Austria, 87% of farm holdings are located in mountain areas. Farms are mainly small-scale, family-run and environmentally friendly, run by farmers who've diversified.
We think that our model is a successful one. The quality of the food that we produce is very important for us. It's a challenge. And for quality products, such as organic or local or natural produce, the price will be higher.
Sales suggest customers can accept this. In Austria, the cost of food is generally higher than in neighbouring countries. Hannes is also keen to pass on the mantra of local natural farming to the next generation.
It's important that it keeps working like this. It has to continue.
This is farming that is traditional, diversified and subsidised. It's supported by both consumers and politicians in Austria and has found a way to turn its weaknesses into strengths.
Well, all Austria's land then, not always the easiest to reap rewards from, and yet it attracts more young farmers than most other EU countries. To tell us a bit more, we're joined now by the Minister for Agriculture, Mr. André Ruprechter. Thanks for your time. Tell me firstly, I believe 10% of Austrian farmers are under the age of 35. How is Austria being so successful at getting its young back on the land?
Actually, we really can say nowadays that Austrian agriculture is a young agriculture, because 20 years ago it was the opposite. We had a very old structure, so a very high degree of farmers above 60 years, and nowadays it's the opposite. And we particularly use the the second pillar of the common agriculture politic, particularly the rural development programs, in order to refocus on the young farmers particularly.
Okay, well, before we look a little bit closer at that reforms to the Common Agricultural Policy, this orchard we're walking in is part of a vocational school that trains people from 15 to 19 years all about agriculture. Let's get their opinion very briefly.
We have a estate at home, wine growing and a bit fruit growing, and I want to take over this estate one day. I know it's a lot of hard work because you have to work also on the weekends, but I think it's just nice to work with the nature, in the nature. Yeah, I like it very much.
I don't know what I'm going to do in the future, but I think not many people know really the hard work behind the products you can buy in the supermarket, and so it's interesting to learn about it.
So this reforms to the Common Agricultural Policy, we're told Austria, and indeed your good self, had a lot of impact in those reforms. What precisely did they change for Austria? Austria gets as much as it did before the reforms, but in different ways?
It's particularly the second pillar of the Common Agricultural Rural Development Policy, which we basically focus on, because it's already the more important part. 60% comes from of the support in agriculture comes from the second pillar in Austria.
So not direct to the farmers?
Most of it is directed directly to the farmer, direct payments for agriculture in less favored areas, particularly mountain areas, but also direct payments, for example, for agri-environment programs. The greening coming from the first pillar in the new CAP was not so much of encouraging our farmers, because that was not a real novelty. Yes.
One thing I've noticed is that a lot of farms in Austria, they tend to be small-sized farms. Does the Common Agricultural Policy provide more now for them than in the past? A lot of people complain that it's really the EU supports the big industrial farmer more.
In Austria we can say that, that we, particularly with the rural development programs, could focus on the small structures, family-scaled farm type in Austria. And also with the new direct payments in the first pillar, with the new organization of these direct payments, we could focus also on small-scale agriculture. We have a small producer scheme also, which is addressed to nearly 30,000 farmers in Austria who use this small-scale regime.
Okay, well, very briefly, because we are walking in an orchard rather, we're talking about a lot of positives, but there's still some negatives. For example, the fruit sector in Austria doing a lot worse than before.
Particularly the fruit sector, but also milk, the dairy sector, and the big meat sector, pork, was really suffering the last 2 years. And the main origin and reason certainly was the Russian embargo, as a result of the EU sanctions towards Russia. And I repeatedly demanded the European Council to rethink and re-evaluate the sanctions and to get out and have establish an exit strategy of the EU sanctions.
Okay, so you think there's need to be lifted. Well, Mr. Ruprechter, it was fabulous to get your insight into the agricultural sector. Thanks so much for your time. Well, as you can see, there are quite a few surprises to Austria's agriculture. We're going to bring you one more now. Some 10% of Austrian farmers are actually in the tourism industry. Johann Bodam brings us to meet one couple that get 40% of their income from holidaymakers on their farm.
CQE, C, 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 CQE,
Jürgen has 10 hectares of meadows and cereal crops on which to graze his 20 cattle. It's just enough for him to remain self-sufficient.
The size of our land is right for the number of animals we have. We don't need to buy anything like feed for the livestock. We use our own reserves for the animals in winter. For me, it's important not to have too many cows.
Jürgen doesn't want to expand the farm he inherited 5 years ago. As well as his meadows, he has 30 hectares of forest. He sells the timber for furniture and firewood. But agriculture and forestry bring in only 60% of his household income.
Martina?
His wife is in charge of the other part of their business.
Martina is the one who looks after the other side of things. We run a holiday farmhouse and it's very important for our income.
It's 40% extra revenue. As young farmers, they managed to get a €10,000 EU subsidy. But they also had to invest €100,000 to renovate the farm for guests.
Last year we had more than 1,000 guests, but half of those were children. We have lots of families coming with 2 parents and 2 children, so half of our clientele are children.
To appeal to this customer base, the Rosingers purchased some animals with little agricultural value, but which are adored by children.
We have 2 ponies, miniature Shetlands. They're especially popular because they can be trusted. They love children. We have 2 rabbits, 2 pygmy goats, and 10 kittens.
10% of Austrian farmers have tourist accommodation, and many provide meals too. In total, there's room for 170,000 visitors. The local tourism office is backing its farm guesthouse owners too.
The farmers need us, and we need farmhouse tourism in return. Our region relies on this kind of small-scale tourism, not mass holidays, not big hotels or massive infrastructure. This kind of slow tourism.
The downsides are that farmers need a large initial investment to put in extra hours to cater for guests, and still they must look after their livestock.
Well, there's no tourists on this farm, but Wolfgang Heckel does open his doors to the public on quite a regular basis, and today going to show us around. Tell us a bit more about this farm. I see chickens, I see apricots.
I started this farm 8 years ago. Then I had 50 hectares of apricot trees and about 600 hens running around the orchard. This year we extended it to 80 hectares of apricot trees.
So quite a sizable farm you have here then. What kind of aid do you get from the European Union? Is it better or worse since these reforms to the Common Agricultural Policy came in place?
Since 2014 and the reforms, there's up to €400,000 worth of aid available per farmer over a 3-year period. That's more than in the past. It used to be limited to €330,000. So I'm happy to see this type of solid support for farmers.
So in the latest CAP reforms, they wanted farms to be more environmentally friendly, but I don't think you think they've come up with the best plan.
We already have lots of vegetation. There are several new environmental measures that differ from the previous CAP programme. Now there's a duty to give 5% of the land over to vegetation and biodiversity. It used to be 3%. In my opinion, here we have land that's naturally green, and I think 3% as a limit was enough.
But do you think for the EU in general, like neighbouring countries like Slovakia, it might make their farms better?
There Austria has a lot of basic setups, whereas in lots of other countries, farms are bigger. There are more developed structures. In Slovakia, farms can be 5,000 hectares in size, big industrial structures. Whereas here in Austria, the average farm is just 25 hectares. So I think for us, 3% was enough.
Okay. And what about young farmers in Austria? Is it easy to get into farming? Are they encouraged by the state and indeed the EU to do so?
I'm not fully up to date on it, but there is support for young farmers starting out. With the previous CAP, I think it was around 10,000 euros. Now that's been increased to between 12 and 15,000. It's really important that young people, young farmers, get support. Of course, it would be great if they were handed 20,000 euros.
Finally, we see on this farm, it's quite a sizable one, unlike many across Austria that tend to be smaller. But one thing we're also seeing here is diversifying from just cultivating crops. Is that a necessity in Austria today?
It's become clear that in this day and age, you can't just work the land. You have to be a businessman and cover a range of different activities. We have to.
Okay. Well, Wolfgang Heckel, it's been lovely learning a bit more about your farm and seeing these wonderful chickens. There you go. And it's with this beautiful chicken that we're going to have to bring this show to a close. Vielen Dank. Auf
Vielen
Wiedersehen.
Dank, hat mich sehr gefreut.
Thanks also to you at home for having watched. That brings us to the end of this edition of Talking Europe. See you again next time. Il est mignon en fait.